In the early months of 1902, in the small, arid town of Khomein, nestled in the central plateau of Persia, a child was born who would eventually alter the course of Middle Eastern history. Ruhollah Khomeini, who would later be known to the world as Ayatollah Khomeini, entered a society standing at a crossroads of ancient tradition and turbulent modernization. To understand the man who would one day dismantle a monarchy and establish a revolutionary theocracy, one must first look back at the quiet, dusty alleys of Khomein, the deep roots of his family tree, and the profound tragedies that marked his earliest years. Persia at the turn of the 20th century was a land of stark contrasts and mounting pressures. Ruled by the fading Qajar dynasty, the country was caught in the suffocating vice of foreign influence. The British Empire to the south and the Russian Empire to the north treated Persia as a chessboard for their imperial ambitions, extracting concessions, controlling customs revenues, and dictating economic terms to a weak central government. For ordinary Persians, life was overwhelmingly rural, agrarian, and poor. Feudal landlords held immense power over peasants, while religious scholars, known as the ulama, served as both spiritual guides and community leaders, commanding deep reverence among the populace. It was within this fragile social fabric that Ruhollah's family maintained its standing. The Mousavi family traced its lineage back centuries, claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad through the lineage of Shia imams, a prestigious pedigree that granted them the title of Sayyid, marked by the black turban Ruhollah would wear for the rest of his life. His father, Ayatollah Sayyid Mostafa Mousavi, was a respected cleric and landowner in Khomein who provided religious instruction, settled local disputes, and defended the villagers against the arbitrary cruelties of local khans and armed bandits. Moreover, this relatively stable upbringing was shattered with breathtaking violence when Ruhollah was barely 5 months old. Sayyid Mostafa, a man known for his independent streak and refusal to submit to local extortionists, crossed paths with a powerful local magnate. While traveling along a dusty road between Khomein and the nearby town of Galpayagan, Mostafa was ambushed and assassinated by hired gunmen. He left behind a young widow, Hajar, several children, and an infant Ruhollah. This early tragedy left an indelible psychological and emotional imprint on the young boy. Growing up fatherless in a violent and lawless provincial environment meant that Ruhollah learned early on about power, injustice, and vulnerability. The absence of a father was mitigated by the fierce protection and guidance of the women in his household: his mother Hajar, his paternal aunt Saghekat, and his older brother Sayyid Mortaza, who would later take the religious title Ayatollah Pasandide. These women instilled in him a resilient spirit, a deep sense of personal dignity, and an uncompromising piety. The domestic sphere of the Mousavi household was entirely anchored in Islamic devotion, prayer, and mourning rituals, particularly the remembrance of Karbala, the foundational narrative of Shia Islam that celebrates martyrdom and defiance against tyranny. In Khomein, religious ceremonies were not merely spiritual exercises. They were community gatherings where historical grievances against oppressive rulers were retold and internalized by the listeners. Young Ruhollah listened intently to these sermons, absorbing the powerful cultural vocabulary of resistance against injustice. Education in Khomein began early. Before he had even reached his teens, Ruhollah was enrolled in local traditional schools known as maktabs, where he memorized passages of the Quran, learned Arabic grammar, and studied Persian classical poetry. He showed a sharp intellect, an exceptional memory, and a serious demeanor that set him apart from his peers. While other boys played games in the dusty courtyards, Ruhollah spent long hours poring over religious texts, guided by local tutors who recognized his aptitude for higher learning. The socio-political landscape of Persia during Ruhollah's childhood was also undergoing a seismic shift. The constitutional revolution of 1905-1911 erupted when Ruhollah was just a small boy, shaking the foundations of Qajar absolutism. Merchants, intellectuals, and reform-minded clerics united to demand a parliament, the rule of law, and a limitation on royal power. Although Khomein was far from the political epicenters of Tehran, Tabriz, and Isfahan, news of the revolution trickled down through traveling merchants, pilgrims, and clerics. The young Ruhollah grew up hearing heated debates about freedom, foreign interference, national sovereignty, and the proper role of Islam in public life. These formative years exposed him to the chaotic reality of a nation struggling to define itself under the weight of foreign dominance and internal corruption. The chaos of World War I further compounded these hardships. Although Persia declared official neutrality, foreign armies, primarily British, Russian, and Ottoman troops, marched back and forth across Persian soil, requisitioning food supplies, destroying crops, and exacerbating a devastating famine that killed a significant portion of the population. Khomein and its surrounding villages were not spared. Hunger, disease, and insecurity were constant companions during Ruhollah's adolescent years. Witnessing the suffering of his countrymen firsthand, combined with the loss of his mother when he was a teenager, hardened Ruhollah's worldview. He watched as foreign powers dictated terms to a powerless government in Tehran, and he saw local strongmen exploit the misery of the peasantry. These experiences planted the initial seeds of an anti-imperialist mindset and a deep conviction that only a moral, Islamic awakening could save the Iranian people from foreign subjugation and moral decay. By the time he reached young adulthood, the quiet scholar of Khomein was ready to expand his horizons. The provincial confines of his hometown could no longer contain his intellectual ambition or his burning desire to master the deep complexities of Islamic jurisprudence and philosophy. Packing his meager belongings, he prepared to leave Khomein for the religious seminaries of Iraq and, ultimately, the holy city of Qom. The boy who had lost his father to violence survived wartime famine and grown up under the shadow of foreign domination, was stepping onto a path that would lead him directly into the heart of Persia's religious and political destiny. The transition from the provincial seclusion of Khomein to the bustling intellectual hub of Iraq, and subsequently, the sacred city of Qom, marked a profound turning point in the young Ruhollah Mousavi's life. Having bid farewell to the dusty alleys and familiar faces of his hometown, he carried with him the resilience forged by early personal tragedies, a fierce sense of personal dignity, and an unyielding commitment to his faith. In the early 1920s, Persia was experiencing a tumultuous political evolution under the rising influence of Reza Khan, but within the walls of the traditional seminaries, the primary battles fought were intellectual, spiritual, and philosophical. It was in this deeply scholarly environment that Ruhollah would immerse himself for decades, slowly transforming from a quiet, studious adolescent into a formidable master of Islamic jurisprudence, philosophy, and mysticism. His initial destination was the nearby city of Iraq, which at the time hosted a prominent seminary led by Ayatollah Sheikh Abdul Karim Hari Yazdi, a revered scholar who would soon relocate to Qom to revitalize its theological institutions. Qom was historically a center of Shia learning, housing the golden-domed shrine of Fatima bint Musa. But by the early 20th century, its scholarly standing had waned compared to the great seminaries of Iraq, such as Najaf and Karbala. Ayatollah Hari Yazdi envisioned restoring Qom to its former glory as the premier intellectual capital of Iranian Shia Islam. When Hari Yazdi moved to Qom, young Ruhollah followed him, becoming part of the foundational cohort of students in a reinvigorated intellectual ecosystem that would shape the future leadership of the country. Life in the Qom seminary was rigorous, austere, and entirely dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge. Students lived in modest, small brick rooms known as hadras, clustered around the courtyards of the main seminary buildings. Resources were scarce, and financial support for students was minimal, relying on religious endowments and voluntary contributions from pious merchants. Ruhollah lived a frugal existence, sharing simple meals, wearing coarse woolen garments, and spending nearly every waking hour reading, debating, and writing. His daily routine began before dawn with morning prayers, followed immediately by hours of attending lectures, known as dars, delivered by senior grand ayatollahs and master scholars. The curriculum of the Qom seminary was vast and deeply demanding, structured around several core disciplines designed to train the mind in rigorous analytical thinking. At the center of this education was Islamic jurisprudence, or fiqh, and the principles of jurisprudence, known as usul al-fiqh. These subjects required students to master complex legal arguments, parse subtle distinctions in religious texts, and understand the intricate methodology used to derive laws from the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet and the Imams. Unlike modern secular legal studies, traditional Islamic jurisprudence demanded a lifetime of dialectical training, where students constantly challenged each other's interpretations in lively, often intense classroom debates. Beyond jurisprudence, Ruhollah demonstrated an early and exceptional aptitude for branches of Islamic scholarship that many traditional clerics approached with hesitation or outright suspicion. Philosophy and mysticism, known as irfan. While many conservative members of the ulama focused exclusively on legalistic rulings, Ruhollah was deeply drawn to the rich traditions of Islamic philosophy, including the works of ancient Greek philosophers translated and reinterpreted by Islamic thinkers like Avicenna, as well as the profound mystical insights of medieval Sufis and philosophers like Mullah Sadra. Irfan sought a direct, experiential knowledge of the divine through spiritual purification, meditation, and deep contemplation of the cosmos. This mystical inclination deeply influenced Ruhollah's worldview, instilling in him a sense of inner certainty, emotional intensity, and a conviction that the material world was merely a fleeting shadow of a higher spiritual reality. He also studied Islamic theology, logic, and Arabic literature, eventually mastering classical Persian and Arabic poetry. His command of language was extraordinary. Later in life, his speeches and writings would combine the precise technical vocabulary of a senior jurist with the soaring, emotive rhetoric of a classical poet. As he progressed through his studies, Ruhollah's reputation within the Qom seminary began to shift. He was no longer just a diligent student. He emerged as a brilliant scholar and a gifted teacher in his own right. By his late 20s and early 30s, he had attained the high rank of mujtahid, a jurist qualified to exercise independent legal reasoning, or ijtihad, freeing him from the necessity of following other scholars' rulings. As a teacher, Ruhollah attracted a dedicated following of younger seminary students who were drawn to his charismatic presence, his sharp intellect, and his uncompromising teaching style. Unlike instructors who lectured in a monotonous, academic tone, Ruhollah taught with a fierce passion and moral urgency. He demanded absolute intellectual rigor from his students, challenging them to think deeply and critically about every concept they encountered. His classes on ethics, known as akhlaq, became legendary within Qom. These were not dry academic lectures. They were profound spiritual sessions where he urged his students to purify their intentions, resist the corrupting temptations of worldly power and wealth, and dedicate their lives entirely to the service of God and justice. During these decades of quiet scholarship, the political landscape outside the seminary walls was undergoing a radical transformation. Riza Khan, who had seized control of the military and later deposed the Qajar dynasty to crown himself Reza Shah Pahlavi in 1925, was aggressively imposing a top-down modernization and secularization program on Iran. Inspired by the westernizing reforms of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk in Turkey, Reza Shah sought to weaken the influence of the traditional ulama, close traditional religious schools, mandate Western-style clothing, ban the traditional veil for women, and subordinate religious institutions to state control. While many senior clerics in Qom chose a strategy of quietism, avoiding direct political confrontation to preserve the basic infrastructure of religious education, Ruhollah watched these developments with mounting alarm and indignation. For Khomeini, the Shah's aggressive westernization was not merely a cultural shift. It was a form of spiritual colonization that threatened the very soul of the Iranian nation and subjugated Muslim lands to Western imperialist dominance. He believed that Islam was not a private spiritual affair confined to mosques and homes, but a comprehensive socio-political system designed to guide human society, maintain justice, and protect the oppressed from tyranny. However, during the 1930s and 1940s, while Reza Shah was in power, and later during the early years of his son Mohammad Reza Shah's reign, Khomeini largely channeled his energies into academic writing, teaching, and spiritual self-discipline rather than active political agitation. He authored several influential scholarly books during this period, including works on Islamic ethics, mystical philosophy, and theology, most notably his 1941 treatise Kashf al-Asrar, The Discovery of Secrets, which served as a stinging intellectual rebuttal to anti-clerical propaganda and laid out his foundational critique of secular governance. In these writings, the dual nature of Khomeini's intellectual formation became clear. He was simultaneously a master of rational legal deduction and a mystic convinced of a divine historical mission. He spent his days parsing legal precedents and his nights in deep, solitary prayer, cultivating a steely inner discipline that would become his hallmark. To his students in Qom, he was a revered master who combined immense scholarly erudition with an austere, forbidding dignity that commanded both deep admiration and cautious reverence. The years spent in the scholarly sanctuary of Qom provided Khomeini with the intellectual armor, the institutional network, and the ideological framework that he would eventually deploy against the Pahlavi monarchy. He built deep personal bonds with a generation of young clerics who would later become the backbone of the Islamic Republic. By the time the political crisis of the 1960s erupted, the quiet scholar of Qom was fully formed, possessing a deeply systematized worldview, a loyal following of devoted disciples, and an unshakable conviction that the religious scholars bore the ultimate responsibility for guiding the destiny of Iran. The intellectual foundation was set. The transition from the quiet study of jurisprudence to the roaring storm of political revolution was now only a matter of time. The quiet intellectual sanctuary of Qom could not remain untouched forever by the rushing tides of national politics. Outside the ancient seminary walls, Iran was undergoing a seismic shift under the rule of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who ascended the throne in 1941 following the forced abdication of his father. The young monarch initially faced a weak central government, foreign occupation by Allied forces during the Second World War, and a fiercely independent parliament led by nationalist figures like Mohammad Mossadegh. However, with vital backing from foreign intelligence agencies, the Shah engineered a coup in 1953 that overthrew Mossadegh, crushed secular nationalist opposition, and restored absolute monarchical authority to the throne. Secure in his power and backed by vast oil revenues and strong ties to Western powers, particularly the United States, the Shah embarked on an ambitious, top-down modernization and westernization program known as the White Revolution in the early 1960s. To Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, watching from his study in Qom, the White Revolution was an existential threat to the religious and cultural identity of Iran. Promoted as a sweeping package of progressive reforms, the program included land reform aimed at breaking up large feudal estates, the privatization of state-owned enterprises, profit-sharing for industrial workers, literacy campaigns, and most contentiously, the granting of voting rights to women. While international observers and some domestic liberals viewed these measures as steps toward modernization, Khomeini saw them through a sharply different lens. He recognized that land reform, while appearing egalitarian, disrupted the traditional economic independence of the religious endowments and the bizarre merchant class, who had long funded the seminaries. Furthermore, he vehemently opposed the enfranchisement of women, viewing it as a superficial Western import designed to corrupt traditional family values and undermine Islamic law. He also lashed out against the extension of legal immunity granted to American military advisors and civilian personnel stationed in Iran under the infamous Status of Forces Agreement, framing it as a humiliating surrender of Iranian sovereignty to foreign imperialists. As dissatisfaction with the Shah's autocratic rule and heavy-handed Western influence simmered among various segments of the population, Khomeini emerged as the most uncompromising and vocal critic of the regime. During the pivotal Shia mourning month of Muharram in June 1963, Khomeini delivered a scathing, historic speech at the Fazihe Madrasa in Qom. In his address, he directly attacked the Shah, comparing him to the oppressive tyrants of Islamic history and warning him of the fate that awaited rulers who defied God and sold out their nation to foreign masters. With blistering rhetoric and fearless moral authority, Khomeini pierced the aura of invincibility surrounding the Pahlavi monarchy. He pointedly asked the Shah whether foreign powers had bought him, warning that if he did not change his disastrous path, the day would come when the Iranian people would cheer his expulsion from the country. The impact of the speech was immediate and electric. Thousands of seminary students, pious merchants, and ordinary citizens absorbed his words, which were secretly recorded, duplicated on cassette tapes, and distributed across the nation. The Shah's regime realized that Khomeini was no longer just an academic cleric writing obscure theological treatises. He had transformed into a dangerous political threat capable of mobilizing the masses. In the dead of night on June 5, 1963, security forces raided Khomeini's residence in Qom, arrested him, and swiftly transferred him under heavy guard to a military prison in Tehran. The news of Khomeini's arrest sent shockwaves through Qom, Tehran, Shiraz, and other major cities, triggering massive, spontaneous uprisings. Thousands of enraged supporters poured into the streets, chanting religious slogans, demanding the release of their leader, and confronting heavily armed security forces. The demonstrations quickly escalated into widespread riots. The regime responded with brutal, uncompromising force, deploying tanks, armored vehicles, and troops to open fire on the crowds. Hundreds of unarmed protesters were killed in the streets of Tehran and Qom during what became known historically as the 15 Khordad Uprising. Although the protests were violently suppressed and order was restored on the surface, the events of June 1963 marked a profound watershed moment in modern Iranian history. The bond between Khomeini and the Iranian masses was cemented in blood and shared sacrifice. Following his arrest, Khomeini was held in military detention for several months while regime officials debated his fate. Some hardline elements within the security apparatus pushed for his execution, arguing that putting a prominent cleric to death was the only way to permanently crush religious dissent. However, senior members of the Iranian clerical establishment intervened to save his life. To protect him from execution under Iranian law, leading clerics quickly elevated his scholarly rank, officially granting him the title of Ayatollah, a formal recognition of his supreme religious authority that afforded him special legal protections under the Constitution. Recognizing that executing him would likely spark an uncontrollable national revolt, the regime opted instead to keep him under strict house arrest in Tehran before ultimately releasing him back to Qom in early 1964, hoping that his return would quiet the tensions. Instead of being chastened by his imprisonment, Khomeini returned to his crusade with renewed vigor and an even sharper political focus. In October 1964, the Iranian parliament passed the controversial capitulations law granting legal immunity to American military personnel. When the news reached Qom, Khomeini delivered another ferocious denunciation of the regime, branding the law as a shameful capitulation to American imperialism, and declaring that the Iranian parliament had sold the nation's independence for American dollars. He declared that if an American cook were to run over the Shah of Iran, no Iranian court could try him, whereas if the Shah were to run over an American dog, he would be prosecuted. The speech was a masterpiece of populist rhetoric that resonated deeply with a public increasingly resentful of foreign domination. This time, the Shah's regime decided that tolerance had reached its absolute limit. On November 4, 1964, elite security forces once again surrounded Khomeini's home in Qom, seized him in the middle of the night, and rushed him directly to Mehrabad Airport in Tehran. From there, he was immediately placed onto a military aircraft bound for forced exile in Turkey. The Shah and his advisors believed that by physically removing Khomeini from Iranian soil, banishing him to a foreign country, and silencing his voice, they had successfully neutralized the primary obstacle to their modernization program. They fundamentally underestimated the resilience of the man, the depth of his ideological framework, and the revolutionary momentum he had already set in motion. The cold winds of Bursa, a historic Turkish city nestled against the slopes of Mount Uludag, offered a stark contrast to the familiar, sun-baked alleys of Qom. In November 1964, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini arrived in Turkey not as a respected guest, but as a political prisoner of the Pahlavi regime, banished from his homeland in the dead of night. The Shah and his Western allies believed that distance and isolation would blunt the edge of his radical vision. They assumed that far away from the holy shrines, the theological seminaries, and the passionate crowds of Iran, the aging cleric would fade into quiet obscurity. Yet, they fundamentally misunderstood the man and the ideological force he represented. Exile would not silence Khomeini. Instead, it would become the crucible in which his revolutionary doctrine was fully forged. Upon his arrival in Turkey, Khomeini was placed under the strict surveillance of Turkish security forces and housed in a modest residence in Bursa. The initial months of his exile were marked by a heavy sense of isolation. Turkish authorities imposed severe restrictions on his movements and visitors. He was forbidden from wearing his traditional clerical turban and flowing robes, forced instead to dress in Western-style suits and headwear while moving about the city. For a senior Shia cleric, whose identity was inextricably bound to his religious garb, this requirement was a profound indignity. Furthermore, language was an immediate barrier. Surrounded by a Turkish-speaking population and military guards, Khomeini found himself cut off from the daily pulse of Persian discourse that had fueled his activism for decades. Despite these daunting constraints, Khomeini refused to remain idle. True to his lifelong discipline as a scholar and teacher, he used the quiet hours of his exile to read, write, and deeply reflect upon the intersection of Islamic jurisprudence and statecraft. He studied philosophical texts, reviewed historical precedents of Islamic governance, and began formulating the rigorous theoretical framework that would ultimately reshape the political architecture of the Middle East. Recognizing that physical banishment in Turkey was too close to Iran and still vulnerable to direct pressure from SAVAK, the Shah's notorious secret police, Khomeini actively sought a relocation to a more traditional and politically advantageous sanctuary. After several months of quiet diplomatic and clerical negotiations involving Iranian religious networks and Iraqi authorities, permission was granted for Khomeini to move to Iraq in October 1965. He chose to settle in Najaf, one of the holiest cities in the Shia Islamic world and the historical heart of traditional scholarship. Najaf was home to the ancient and prestigious Hawza, a network of religious seminaries that attracted students and scholars from across the globe. For Khomeini, returning to the vibrant intellectual environment of Najaf was like stepping back onto fertile soil. Here, he could once again wear his traditional clerical robes, speak in his native Persian and fluent Arabic, and immerse himself in a community of receptive religious scholars. Najaf provided Khomeini with a platform far more powerful than the one he had left behind in Qom. The city was a major crossroads for international pilgrims, theological students, and political dissidents from various parts of the Muslim world. Around him, a dedicated circle of loyal disciples, students, and exiled activists began to gather. These individuals served as a vital bridge between Khomeini and his homeland. They transcribed his lectures, smuggled his clandestine cassette tapes and political pamphlets across the Iraqi-Iranian border, and maintained a secure channel of communication with the burgeoning religious opposition networks operating secretly inside Iran. The political landscape of Iraq during the mid-1960s was volatile, marked by shifting regimes and internal power struggles. While the Iraqi government initially viewed Khomeini's presence with cautious tolerance, seeing him as a useful irritant to their regional rival, the Shah of Iran, they kept a wary eye on his growing influence. Khomeini, for his part, maintained a disciplined focus, deliberately avoiding entanglement in complex Iraqi domestic politics. Instead, he concentrated all his intellectual and political energies on building an international network of followers and refining his ultimate critique of secular governance. It was during his years in Najaf that Khomeini developed his most radical and consequential political doctrine, Velayat-e, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. For centuries, traditional Shia political quietism had argued that true Islamic governance could only be restored upon the return of the occulted Imam Mahdi, and that, until that divine reappearance, pious Muslims should maintain a cautious distance from state power while offering moral guidance to secular rulers. Khomeini shattered this centuries-old consensus with bold theological audacity. In a series of lectures delivered to his seminary students in Najaf in early 1970, which were quickly transcribed and published as a book, he argued that Islamic law was complete, eternal, and designed specifically to govern human society in all its aspects. Khomeini asserted that leaving the administration of an Islamic society in the hands of secular monarchs, corrupt politicians, or foreign imperialists was a direct violation of divine law. He maintained that in the absence of the infallible imam, supreme authority, both spiritual and political, must rest with a just, knowledgeable, and pious Islamic jurist who possessed expertise in Islamic jurisprudence. This jurist, or faqih, was not merely a spiritual advisor. He was the legitimate head of state, charged with executing divine laws, protecting the community from tyranny and foreign domination, and maintaining public order. This revolutionary thesis turned traditional Islamic political theory on its head, transforming the clerical class from passive observers of the state into active, militant contenders for supreme political power. The dissemination of Velayat-e sent shockwaves through the traditional clerical establishments in both Iraq and Iran. Many senior ayatollahs in Najaf and Qom initially viewed Khomeini's ideas with deep skepticism, fearing that mixing the sacred authority of religion with the dirty realities of politics would corrupt Islam and lead to disastrous consequences. Some traditionalists argued that his aggressive political posture was reckless and invited brutal retaliation from the Pahlavi state. However, among younger seminarians, radicalized students, and anti-regime activists, Khomeini's writings acted as an electric shock. They provided a clear, ideological blueprint for revolution, a coherent answer to the question of what would replace the Shah's monarchy once it was overthrown. From his modest study in Najaf, Khomeini also cultivated strategic alliances with a diverse array of opposition groups. While his core base remained firmly rooted in the traditional religious classes, the bazaar merchants, and pious urban masses, he recognized that successfully toppling a heavily armed, modern autocracy like the Pahlavi regime required a broad coalition. He quietly reached out to left-leaning student groups, secular nationalists, and guerrilla organizations operating both inside Iran and abroad. Although he harbored deep ideological suspicions toward Marxist and secular leftist ideologies, Khomeini pragmatically focused on their shared, overriding objective, the immediate overthrow of the Shah and the elimination of American influence in Iran. As the years progressed into the mid-1970s, Khomeini's network expanded globally. His writings and speeches were translated into multiple languages and distributed among Iranian diaspora communities in Europe and North America, galvanizing students studying abroad. These student networks organized protests, published anti-regime newsletters, and lobbied international human rights organizations to expose the brutal crackdowns carried out by Savak against political dissidents in Iran. The international profile of the exiled cleric grew steadily, transforming him from a domestic religious agitator into a globally recognized symbol of resistance against authoritarianism and superpower hegemony. The Shah's regime watched these developments with growing alarm, realizing that the quiet confines of Najaf were not isolating Khomeini as they had hoped. Iranian intelligence agencies began pressuring the Iraqi government to restrict his activities further. In 1978, as domestic unrest inside Iran began to swell into an undeniable national crisis, the Iraqi government, now heavily influenced by a rising Saddam Hussein who sought to improve diplomatic ties with the Shah, decided to tighten the screws on Khomeini. Iraqi security forces placed his home under virtual house arrest, cut off his telephone lines, and barred visitors from entering. Faced with mounting hostility and sensing that Iraq was no longer a viable base for his operations, Khomeini made a bold decision. Rather than seeking refuge in another Middle Eastern nation where he would face similar political constraints, he chose to relocate to the heart of the Western world. In October 1978, he packed his few belongings and boarded a commercial flight bound for Velayat-e, a quiet suburb of Paris. The Shah and his advisors, blinded by their own hubris, viewed this move as yet another step toward total irrelevance, completely unaware that placing the most dangerous critic of the Pahlavi dynasty directly into the global media capital of Europe would ignite the final, unstoppable spark of the Iranian Revolution. The crisp autumn air of October 1978 welcomed Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini as he stepped off an airplane in France, leaving behind the stifling restrictions and mounting pressures of Iraqi surveillance. Settling into Velayat-e, a quiet, leafy suburb located just outside Paris, the aging cleric entered an environment that stood in radical, stunning contrast to the traditional theological hubs of Qom and Najaf. France offered a free press, robust international telecommunications, and unhindered access to global media outlets. What the Shah and his intelligence advisors catastrophically miscalculated as a move toward total obscurity turned out to be the ultimate amplifier of Khomeini's revolutionary message. Far from being silenced by the distance or distracted by Western culture, Khomeini turned a modest, two-story house surrounded by a gravel yard into the nerve center of a massive, coordinated political upheaval that would soon dismantle the Pahlavi monarchy. Within days of his arrival, the sleepy French village was transformed into an extraordinary global crossroads. Journalists, foreign correspondents, television crews, human rights advocates, exiled Iranian intellectuals, and curious onlookers converged upon Velayat-e in unprecedented numbers. Every day, reporters from major news networks across Europe, North America, and Asia set up their heavy cameras and audio equipment along the narrow village streets, eager to capture a glimpse of the man poised to reshape the Middle East. Khomeini maintained a strict, austere daily routine amidst this media circus. Dressed immaculately in his traditional black turban and dark clerical robes, he would spend hours sitting calmly on a simple rug spread across the grass in his modest backyard, receiving visitors, dictating statements, and granting interviews to journalists from every corner of the globe. His calm, unshakable demeanor projected an aura of supreme spiritual authority and unyielding resolve, contrasting sharply with the increasingly panicked and desperate posture of the Shah's regime back in Tehran. The secret to Khomeini's extraordinary effectiveness from his French sanctuary lay in his brilliant mastery of modern communication technology. While the Pahlavi state tightly controlled all domestic newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television channels inside Iran, they completely underestimated the unstoppable power of modern audio cassettes. In Nofal-e-Shadao, Khomeini recorded his fiery political speeches, religious sermons, and directives to the Iranian nation on small cassette tapes. These tapes were handed directly to trusted couriers, students, and travelers boarding commercial flights bound for Tehran. Upon arrival in Iran, these clandestine recordings were duplicated by the thousands in local mosques, university dormitories, and bazaar networks, then rapidly distributed to the public. Millions of Iranians listened to Khomeini's deep, resonant voice echoing through cassette players in living rooms, taxicabs, and workshops across the country. This acoustic network bypassed state censorship entirely, allowing the exiled leader to speak directly, intimately, and powerfully to the hearts and minds of his people. In addition to audio cassettes, the telephone became an unprecedented instrument of mass revolution. Journalists and supporters in Paris established direct telephone links with opposition leaders inside Iran. Khomeini would speak into a standard telephone receiver, delivering speeches or answering urgent questions that were simultaneously broadcast over amplified speaker systems to massive, ecstatic crowds gathered in university halls, religious gatherings, and secret meetings in Tehran. These live transmissions bridged the vast geographical divide between Paris and Iran, making it feel as though the Ayatollah was standing right beside his followers. The immediacy of this technology galvanized the population, transforming isolated pockets of dissent into a unified, national chorus of defiance against royal rule. As the autumn weeks of 1978 rolled into winter, the situation inside Iran deteriorated rapidly for the Shah. Nationwide strikes paralyzed the vital petroleum industry, banking sector, and government offices, while massive, unprecedented street demonstrations brought major cities like Tehran, Isfahan, and Tabriz to a complete standstill. Millions of protesters marched shoulder to shoulder, chanting slogans against autocracy, foreign interference, and corruption, while openly holding up photographs of Khomeini as their undisputed symbol of hope and resistance. The Pahlavi regime's attempts to suppress the uprising through military curfews, martial law, and deadly crackdowns only fueled public outrage, swelling the ranks of the movement and eroding what little legitimacy the monarchy had left among the populace. From his vantage point in France, Khomeini carefully orchestrated this escalating crisis. He issued a steady stream of communiques rejecting any form of compromise, coalition government, or power-sharing agreement with the Shah, insisting that true peace could only be achieved through the complete collapse of the monarchy and the total dismantling of royal authority. When moderate political figures, liberal nationalists, and foreign diplomats attempted to broker deals to save the throne, Khomeini firmly rebuffed them, maintaining that the Shah must abdicate and leave the country before any constructive political transition could begin. His unwavering stance united disparate factions of the opposition, ranging from devout traditionalists and bazaar merchants to secular leftists and student radicals, under a single, powerful objective. The global media spotlight shining constantly on Nofal-e-Shadao also provided Khomeini with a vital shield of international protection. Surrounded constantly by international journalists and human rights observers, the French government ensured that the Ayatollah remained safe from covert operations or foreign threats. More importantly, Western governments, including the United States, began to realize that the Shah's regime was terminally fractured and unsustainable. Diplomatic channels were quietly opened between Western officials and Khomeini's inner circle in Paris to discuss the peaceful evacuation of foreign nationals and the future stability of Iran's oil supplies once the government fell. Khomeini handled these delicate diplomatic probes with shrewd pragmatism, assuring foreign powers that an Islamic Republic would honor international economic agreements while firmly asserting Iran's absolute national sovereignty and independence from foreign meddling. By late December 1978, the writing was clearly on the wall for the Pahlavi dynasty. The Shah, facing terminal illness, widespread rebellion, and the complete withdrawal of domestic and international support, appointed a moderate civilian prime minister in a desperate, last-ditch effort to appease the public. But it was far too late. The streets of Iran belonged to the revolution, and the nation's collective gaze was fixed entirely on the modest house in France where their leader resided. Khomeini began making concrete preparations for his triumphant homecoming, consulting with advisors on how to manage the impending transfer of power and establish provisional administrative structures. The months spent in Nofal-e-Shadou had elevated him from a regional religious dissident into a globally recognized revolutionary icon, proving that distance, rather than weakening his cause, had given him the world stage from which to orchestrate the downfall of a centuries-old imperial throne. The departure of Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi in mid-January 1979 left a massive political vacuum in Iran, triggering scenes of unbridled public celebration across the nation. Millions of citizens poured into the streets, distributing sweets, sounding car horns, and tearing down statues of the monarchy. With the royal government effectively collapsing and the provisional administration struggling to assert control, attention shifted entirely toward France. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini announced his imminent return to Tehran, setting the stage for a historic homecoming after nearly 15 years of forced exile. The announcement electrified the population, while military leaders and foreign governments watched with intense anxiety to see how the powerful armed forces would react to the cleric's return. On the morning of February 1, 1979, a chartered Air France Boeing 747 touched down at Remade International Airport in Tehran. A hushed anticipation gripped the nation as the aircraft door opened and the 78-year-old Ayatollah emerged, descending the steps accompanied by international journalists and trusted aides. Stepping onto Iranian soil for the first time since 1964, Khomeini was greeted by an elaborate welcoming committee and thousands of ecstatic supporters. Security was a paramount concern, as elements of the military and radical factions remained unpredictable, prompting organizers to arrange a secure transfer away from the tarmac amidst tight coordination. To bypass potential threats and manage the colossal crowds gathered at the airport, Khomeini boarded a helicopter that transported him directly toward the Beheshti Zahra cemetery on the southern outskirts of Tehran, where martyrs of the revolution were buried. However, the scale of the human tide defied all expectations. An estimated millions of people lined the highways and streets, forming a continuous human ocean that stretched for miles. The overwhelming masses completely surrounded the motorcade, making vehicular movement nearly impossible and forcing the vehicle to crawl at a snail's pace through a sea of cheering, weeping, and chanting citizens waving portraits of the religious leader. Arriving at the cemetery, Khomeini delivered a powerful, historic address that defined the immediate trajectory of the revolution. In his firm, resonant voice, he directly challenged the legitimacy of the remaining government structures and declared that he would appoint his own cabinet to supersede the existing regime. He condemned the decades of foreign interference and imperial rule, signaling that a profound transformation of Iranian society, law, and governance was now underway. His words served as both a victory declaration for the revolutionary masses and a stern warning to any remaining political rivals who hoped to preserve remnants of the old system. The days following his arrival saw a rapid acceleration of power transfers. Khomeini established his operational headquarters at a local school in Tehran, where endless streams of politicians, military commanders, religious scholars, and ordinary citizens sought an audience with the new de facto leader of the country. Behind the scenes, negotiations intensified as military generals realized they could no longer sustain the crumbling royal infrastructure. By mid-February, key military units announced their neutrality, effectively sealing the fate of the provisional government. The triumphant victory of the Islamic Revolution was complete, forever altering the geopolitical landscape of the Middle East and bringing a definitive end to centuries of monarchical rule in Iran. With the monarchy abolished and the provisional government swept aside by the unstoppable momentum of the masses, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini faced the monumental task of constructing an entirely new political order from the ashes of the old regime. The ultimate goal was no longer merely opposition, but creation, transforming a traditional Islamic society and a revolutionary movement into a functioning, modern state governed by religious law. This ambitious project required redefining the relationship between religion, politics, and the citizenry, turning abstract theological theories into concrete constitutional realities. The immediate vehicle for this transformation was a national referendum held in March 1979, just weeks after Khomeini's triumphant return to Tehran. Iranian citizens were asked to vote on a simple yet profound question: whether they favored establishing an Islamic Republic. Across the country, polling stations saw massive turnouts, with millions of voters eager to participate in shaping the nation's future. The results were overwhelming, with an official report indicating that over 98% of participating voters chose the Islamic Republic. For Khomeini and his supporters, this landslide vote provided undeniable democratic and popular legitimacy for the sweeping changes that were about to follow. Following the referendum, the focus shifted to drafting a new constitution that would institutionalize the ideals of the revolution. To accomplish this, the government organized an election for a specialized body known as the Assembly of Experts for Constitution, consisting largely of trusted clerics, legal scholars, and loyal revolutionaries. This assembly was tasked with reviewing and finalizing the draft constitution, ensuring that it aligned strictly with Islamic jurisprudence. While various political factions, ranging from secular liberals to moderate Islamic modernists, hoped for a constitutional framework that balanced democratic representation with civil liberties, Khomeini and his core allies ensured that ultimate authority remained anchored in religious leadership. At the center of this new institutional architecture was the groundbreaking and controversial doctrine of Velayat-e, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Developed by Khomeini during his years in exile, this principle argued that in the absence of the infallible 12 imams, a qualified Islamic jurist must hold supreme political and religious authority over the community. When this concept was embedded into the final text of the new constitution, it established a dual system of governance. On one side stood elected institutions, including a president, a parliament, and a prime minister, which handled the day-to-day administration of the state. On the other side stood the supreme leader, positioned at the absolute apex of power, holding veto authority over legislation, command of the armed forces, and control over key judicial and media appointments. Khomeini himself naturally assumed the role of the first supreme leader, becoming the undisputed center of gravity in Iranian politics. Operating primarily from his humble residence in the religious city of Qom or his office in Tehran, he exerted profound influence over national policy. His leadership style combined the charisma of a revolutionary populist with the authoritarian resolve of a traditional patriarch. Whenever political friction arose between the elected branches of government and the clerical establishment, Khomeini's words served as the final, unchallengeable arbiter. He viewed the Islamic Republic not just as a national government, but as a vanguard for global Islamic awakening, frequently reminding his followers that the revolution belonged to the oppressed masses. To safeguard the newborn republic from both internal subversion and external threats, Khomeini and his allies rapidly authorized the creation of powerful new institutions parallel to traditional state agencies. Foremost among these was the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, commonly known as the IRG, established in the spring of 1979. Originally formed from various revolutionary militias that had fought against the Shah's security forces. The Irq evolved into a formidable military force dedicated explicitly to protecting the Islamic regime and its ideological foundations. Alongside the Revolutionary Guards, parallel judicial committees, revolutionary courts, and oversight bodies were established to purge remnants of the old regime, enforce Islamic moral codes, and root out perceived counter-revolutionaries. These new political and religious institutions fundamentally reconfigured public life in Iran. The judiciary was overhauled to replace secular civil codes with interpretations of Islamic Sharia law, affecting everything from family law to criminal sentencing. Educational curricula, media broadcasts, and cultural institutions were systematically reviewed and reshaped to reflect Islamic values and eliminate Western cultural influences, which Khomeini frequently denounced as decadent and corrupting. For millions of devout Iranians, these changes represented a long-awaited purification of society and the restoration of authentic national dignity. They embraced the new religious order with immense enthusiasm, seeing the Islamic Republic as the realization of justice and faith. However, the rapid consolidation of clerical authority also sowed the seeds of deep division. Many secular intellectuals, liberals, ethnic minorities, and leftists who had fought alongside Islamists to overthrow the Shah began to realize that their vision of a pluralistic, democratic republic was being cast aside. Protests and localized uprisings erupted in various regions, including Kurdistan, Turkmensara, and Khuzestan, as different groups demanded greater autonomy or political freedom. Khomeini responded to these challenges with uncompromising firmness, viewing dissent not as legitimate political debate, but as a betrayal of the revolution and a threat to the survival of the Islamic State. By late 1979, the foundational architecture of the Islamic Republic was firmly in place. The new constitution had been ratified, the supreme leadership established, and parallel security and political structures cemented. Khomeini had successfully translated his religious philosophy into a functioning state apparatus, fundamentally altering the trajectory of Iranian history. Yet, as the domestic opposition grew increasingly restive and international tensions mounted, particularly with the United States, the fledgling republic prepared to face even greater trials that would test its resilience to the core. With the formal establishment of the Islamic Republic and the ratification of its new constitution, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and his loyal allies turned their full attention toward a monumental challenge: consolidating the revolution by eliminating political rivals and reshaping the fabric of Iranian society. The victory over the Shah's regime had been achieved through a broad coalition of diverse political factions, ranging from devout Islamists and traditional clerics to secular liberals, Marxist leftists, democratic nationalists, and various ethnic minority groups. However, once the common enemy was removed, the fundamental ideological differences between these groups quickly resurfaced. Khomeini and the core leadership of the Islamic Republic were determined that the state would not succumb to Western-style liberalism or secular socialism, viewing any ideological divergence as an existential threat to the divine order they had established. The first major fault lines emerged around the question of political pluralism and the scope of clerical authority. During the final months of 1979 and into 1980, various political organizations that had played a role in the revolution sought to carve out an independent space within the new political system. Among the most prominent moderate and liberal groups was the Freedom Movement of Iran, led by figures like Mehdi Bazargan, who had served as the first prime minister of the interim government. Bazargan and his allies advocated for a democratic republic that respected civil liberties, freedom of the press, and international norms, while incorporating Islamic ethical principles. However, their vision collided directly with Khomeini's doctrine of Velayat-e, which placed absolute sovereignty in the hands of the religious jurist rather than the electorate. Simultaneously, leftist and Marxist organizations, such as the People's Mujahedin of Iran and the Fateh-e Khalq, mobilized substantial followings, particularly among university students, urban workers, and intellectuals. These groups argued that the true goals of the revolution, social justice, economic equality, and the elimination of imperialist influence, could only be achieved through a radical socialist transformation. They viewed the clerical establishment as a reactionary force attempting to turn back the clock on social progress. For a brief period, university campuses across Iran became vibrant, highly polarized battlegrounds of ideas, where Islamic student associations and leftist factions engaged in fierce debates, propaganda campaigns, and occasional street clashes. Khomeini recognized that allowing these rival ideological currents to organize freely would inevitably fracture the newborn republic and undermine his authority. Rather than engaging in prolonged democratic compromise, the clerical leadership initiated a systematic campaign of political marginalization and suppression. State-backed media outlets, revolutionary committees, and the newly formed Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps began targeting opposition groups, labeling them as counter-revolutionaries, Western puppets, or enemies of Islam. The government framed the political struggle not as a healthy debate between differing civil factions, but as a cosmic battle between the faithful masses and corrupt infiltrators seeking to destroy the Islamic Republic from within. The process of suppression intensified significantly with the onset of the Cultural Revolution in the spring of 1980. Khomeini and his allies identified universities as the primary breeding grounds for secularism, Marxism, and opposition to clerical rule. Under the banner of purifying higher education and aligning it with Islamic values, the government ordered the temporary closure of all universities across Iran. A newly formed body, the headquarters for the Cultural Revolution, was established to purge university faculties and student bodies of anyone deemed ideologically unfaithful or politically disloyal. Thousands of professors and lecturers lost their positions, and countless students associated with leftist or liberal groups were expelled. When the universities eventually reopened, their curricula, textbooks, and administrative structures had been thoroughly overhauled to reflect official Islamic theology and revolutionary ideology. Beyond the academic sphere, the regime systematically dismantled the institutional bases of rival political parties and independent newspapers. Dozens of secular and leftist publications were banned for spreading falsehoods or undermining national unity. Offices belonging to the Freedom Movement, the National Front, and various Marxist organizations were raided, shut down, or taken over by pro-regime militias. Prominent politicians and intellectuals who dared to criticize the centralizing power of the supreme leader found themselves facing harassment, arbitrary arrest, or trial before revolutionary tribunals. Mehdi Bazargan, though permitted to remain a member of parliament for a time, saw his political influence steadily eroded as the space for moderate opposition vanished entirely. The tension reached a dramatic and violent climax in the summer of 1981, following a bitter falling out between the regime and Abul Hassan Banisadr, Iran's first democratically elected president. Initially supported by Khomeini, Banisadr had grown increasingly critical of the monopoly of power wielded by the Islamic Republican Party and the clerical establishment. He attempted to build a coalition of liberals, moderate nationalists, and disaffected leftists to check the power of the clergy. Khomeini, viewing Banisadr's actions as a dangerous attempt to subvert the constitutional order, stripped him of his constitutional powers as commander-in-chief and endorsed a parliamentary vote of no confidence. Banisadr was forced into hiding and eventually fled the country disguised as a woman aboard an Iranian Air Force jet. The removal of Banisadr triggered an open and bloody confrontation between the state and the People's Mujahedin of Iran, which abandoned peaceful opposition and launched an armed insurgency against the clerical regime. The MEK carried out a wave of devastating bombings and targeted assassinations aimed at crippling the leadership of the Islamic Republic. In June 1981, a massive bomb explosion at the headquarters of the Islamic Republican Party in Tehran killed more than 70 high-ranking officials, including Ayatollah Mohammad Beheshti, the Chief Justice, and one of Khomeini's closest and most influential deputies. A few months later, another explosion killed President Mohammad Ali Rajai and Prime Minister Mohammad Javad Bahanar. Khomeini and the regime responded to these violent attacks with unyielding severity. The state security apparatus, reinforced by revolutionary courts operating outside standard legal frameworks, unleashed a massive wave of arrests, mass trials, and swift executions directed against suspected members and sympathizers of armed opposition groups. Thousands of young men and women, many of them idealistic students who had participated in the anti-Shah revolution, were executed by firing squads or imprisoned under brutal conditions in facilities like Evin Prison. The severity of the crackdown effectively crushed the armed internal opposition, leaving the clerical establishment in undisputed control of the political landscape. Alongside the suppression of political rivals, the regime set about fundamentally transforming Iran's legal, judicial, and social systems to conform strictly with Islamic Sharia law. The civil code, largely modeled on Western legal traditions during the Pahlavi era, was systematically dismantled and replaced with religious jurisprudence interpreted by conservative jurists. Family laws were altered to roll back women's rights gained in previous decades, reinstating traditional rules regarding marriage, divorce, child custody, and inheritance. Mandatory dress codes were enforced in public spaces, requiring all women to wear the hijab, while alcohol consumption, Western music, and other cultural practices deemed decadent or un-Islamic were strictly prohibited. These sweeping societal changes were accompanied by a massive ideological mobilization campaign designed to permeate every aspect of daily life. State-controlled radio, television, and print media broadcasted religious lectures, revolutionary chants, and commemorations of martyrs around the clock. Neighborhood committees, known as comités, patrolled streets to enforce moral codes and monitor citizens for suspicious behavior. Educational textbooks were rewritten to emphasize Islamic martyrdom, revolutionary duty, and absolute loyalty to the supreme leader. For devout traditionalists, these measures represented a long-overdue moral purification of society, restoring Islamic values and national dignity after decades of what they perceived as spiritual colonization by the West. However, for millions of urban professionals, modern women, ethnic minorities, and secular citizens, the consolidation of the revolution brought profound alienation, fear, and a sense of betrayal. The promise of freedom and democracy that had animated the mass demonstrations against the Shah was replaced by a rigid, authoritarian system that brooked no dissent. Ethnic minority uprisings in regions such as Kurdistan and Iranian Balochistan, which demanded cultural and political autonomy within the new state, were met with overwhelming military force by the Revolutionary Guards, resulting in significant loss of life and deep-seated regional grievances that persisted for decades. By the end of 1981, through a combination of ideological fervor, institutional engineering, and ruthless suppression of domestic opposition, Khomeini had successfully consolidated the authority of the Islamic Republic. The fragile coalition of diverse revolutionary factions had been thoroughly dissolved, replaced by a monolithic political order centered entirely around the supreme leader and the clerical establishment. The pluralistic aspirations of the anti-Shah movement were extinguished, and Iran was firmly set on a path of radical Islamic governance. Yet, even as internal resistance was subdued, the nascent regime faced an even greater external calamity that would test its survival on the battlefield. Even as Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini and the ruling clergy were aggressively crushing internal political dissent and cementing a monolithic religious order across Iran. A profound external threat materialized that would threaten the very survival of the Islamic Republic. For years, historical tensions, territorial disputes, and ideological friction had simmered between revolutionary Iran and the Ba'athist regime in neighboring Iraq, led by President Saddam Hussein. Saddam watched the unfolding events in Tehran with deep alarm and calculated ambition. The Iraqi dictator feared that Khomeini's revolutionary ideology, particularly the explicit calls to export the Islamic Revolution to Shia populations across the region, would inspire Iraq's repressed Shia majority to rise up against his secular, Sunni-dominated Arab nationalist government. Furthermore, Saddam saw a weakened and isolated post-revolutionary Iran, its regular military demoralized by purges and international arms embargoes, as a prime opportunity to seize disputed border territories, most notably the oil-rich Khuzestan province and full sovereignty over the strategic Shat al-Arab waterway. On September 22, 1980, these underlying tensions erupted into open warfare when the Iraqi armed forces launched a massive, unprovoked surprise invasion of western and southwestern Iran. Iraqi warplanes bombed key Iranian airbases, cities, and infrastructure, while heavily armored ground divisions crossed the international border, expecting a swift and easy military victory. Saddam Hussein calculated that the chaos of the revolution had left Iran crippled, divided, and incapable of mounting an effective defense, predicting that the new regime in Tehran would collapse within weeks. However, the Iraqi leadership fundamentally miscalculated the fierce patriotic and religious fervor unleashed by the revolution. Across Iran, the external aggression served as a powerful catalyst for national unity, momentarily bridging the deep political and social divides that had torn the country apart in the wake of the Shah's fall. Ayatollah Khomeini immediately recognized the invasion not merely as a conventional military conflict between two nation-states, but as a sacred existential struggle for the defense of Islam and the Iranian homeland. In his speeches and public addresses, Khomeini framed the war in deeply spiritual and binary terms, depicting the Iranian nation as the vanguard of righteousness battling against the forces of global arrogance and modern idolatry. He cast Saddam Hussein as an American-backed aggressor and an enemy of true faith, urging every Iranian citizen to rally to the defense of the country. This religious framing transformed what could have been a standard geopolitical border war into a holy crusade, invoking powerful Shia motifs of martyrdom, sacrifice, and resistance against tyranny that resonated deeply with millions of religious Iranians. As regular Iranian military units struggled to reorganize under wartime pressures, the regime mobilized vast new reservoirs of manpower through ideological and religious networks. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, alongside the newly established Basij volunteer militia, played a crucial and ferocious role in halting the initial Iraqi advance. The Basij drew hundreds of thousands of volunteers, ranging from young teenagers to elderly men, who were motivated by fervent religious devotion and loyalty to Khomeini. Armed with ideological zeal and a willingness to embrace martyrdom, these volunteer forces were deployed to the front lines in massive, wave-like infantry assaults. Their sacrifices, though accompanied by devastating casualties, successfully blunted the Iraqi armored thrust and prevented the fall of key cities like Ahvaz and Khorramshahr. The human and economic cost of the conflict escalated rapidly into an unimaginable catastrophe. The Iran-Iraq War settled into a brutal, grinding war of attrition reminiscent of the trenches of the First World War. Cities near the border were subjected to relentless artillery bombardment and missile attacks, reducing residential neighborhoods to rubble and displacing millions of civilians who fled inland as refugees. Both sides hurled human waves into heavily fortified defensive networks, minefields, and barbed wire. Furthermore, as the war dragged on and the stalemate deepened, Iraq resorted to desperate measures, including the extensive and illegal use of chemical weapons, such as mustard gas and nerve agents, against Iranian troops and civilian border towns. The horrific suffering inflicted by these chemical attacks left tens of thousands of Iranians with lifelong injuries and deep psychological trauma, while the international community largely turned a blind eye to the atrocities. Despite the staggering loss of life and the immense devastation inflicted upon Iran's economy, which was further crippled by collapsing global oil prices and international sanctions, Khomeini maintained an uncompromising stance on the continuation of the war. For the first 2 years of the conflict, Iranian forces successfully drove the invading Iraqi army off Iranian soil, culminating in the triumphant recapture of the strategic port city of Khorramshahr in May 1982. Following this major victory, many military commanders and foreign observers expected Tehran to seek a negotiated peace or a ceasefire. However, Khomeini and the hardline leadership rejected peace overtures from Iraq and international mediators. Emboldened by military momentum, Khomeini declared that the war would continue until the aggressor regime in Baghdad was overthrown, reparations were paid, and justice was served for the Iranian people. This maximalist objective involved launching counterinvasions into Iraqi territory, dragging out a bloody conflict that would endure for nearly 7 more years. The prolonged nature of the war placed an enormous strain on Iranian society, testing the limits of public endurance and economic resilience. Food rationing, fuel shortages, electricity blackouts, and soaring inflation became standard features of daily life. Funerals for young soldiers and volunteers killed at the front became ubiquitous community events, held daily in virtually every town and city across the country. Yet, the state apparatus utilized these sacrifices to reinforce its ideological grip, transforming grief into a powerful instrument of political conformity. Families of martyrs were granted social status and financial stipends, while public squares, walls, and textbooks were saturated with imagery commemorating fallen soldiers as eternal heroes of the Islamic Revolution. Dissent against the war effort was treated as treason, ensuring that public criticism of the regime's military strategy remained virtually non-existent. By 1988, the cumulative weight of the protracted conflict pushed Iran to the brink of total exhaustion. The economy was shattered. Oil exports had been severely disrupted by Iraqi attacks on tankers in the Persian Gulf, and military morale was waning in the face of continuous stalemate and mounting casualties. Moreover, direct military interventions by the United States and its Western allies in the Persian Gulf to protect shipping lanes placed Iran in an increasingly precarious international position, culminating in the tragic shootdown of an Iranian commercial airliner by the USS Vincennes in July 1988, which resulted in the deaths of all 290 civilians on board. Recognizing that total victory was no longer achievable, and that the continuation of the war threatened the very survival of the Islamic Republic, top military and political advisors finally convinced Khomeini to accept United Nations Security Council Resolution 598. The decision to accept a ceasefire was a deeply agonizing moment for the aging supreme leader, who famously remarked that drinking the poison of peace was more bitter than death itself. On July 18, 1988, Iran officially accepted the ceasefire, bringing an end to nearly 8 years of horrific bloodshed and destruction. The war left hundreds of thousands of Iranians dead, over 1 million wounded or disabled, and hundreds of billions of dollars in economic damage. Yet, despite the immense suffering and the failure to achieve the regime's stated goal of overthrowing Saddam Hussein, Khomeini framed the conclusion of the war as a divine victory. He asserted that the nation had successfully preserved its Islamic identity, thwarted foreign imperialism, and defended its sovereignty against a coalition of hostile powers. The crucible of the Iran-Iraq War ultimately forged the iron core of the post-revolutionary state, cementing the power of the military-religious apparatus and leaving an indelible, tragic legacy on generations of Iranians. While the guns of the brutal Iran-Iraq War finally fell silent in the summer of 1988, the ideological fires ignited by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini continued to burn fiercely across the nation. The survival of the new Islamic Republic was no longer threatened by the invading armies of Saddam Hussein, but Khomeini's grand vision for Iran was never just about protecting borders or defending territory. His ultimate goal was always to create a perfectly pure Islamic society at home and to challenge the entire global political order abroad. Throughout his 10 years as the supreme leader of Iran, his uncompromising decisions shocked the world, isolated his country, and fundamentally changed the daily lives of millions of Iranian citizens. Faith and political power were deeply combined to create a ruling system that accepted absolutely no compromise, leading to a decade filled with intense domestic and international controversy. Even though the long war with Iraq defined much of the 1980s, Iran's relationship with the outside world had already been shattered years earlier by an event that came to completely define Khomeini's rule in the eyes of the Western world. This event was the United States Embassy hostage crisis. In November 1979, just a few months after the success of the revolution, a group of radical Iranian university students climbed over the walls of the American embassy compound in the center of Tehran. These students were extremely angry that the United States government had allowed the exiled Shah of Iran to enter America for cancer treatment. The students and many other Iranians deeply feared a repeat of history. They remembered the year 1953, when the American Central Intelligence Agency helped to overthrow Iran's democratically elected prime minister and brought the Shah back to absolute power. They believed the American embassy was a den of spies planning to destroy their new revolution. The students violently took over the embassy and took dozens of American diplomats, guards, and ordinary citizens hostage. Initially, the temporary Iranian government did not plan or approve this illegal action. However, Ayatollah Khomeini quickly saw a massive political opportunity in the crisis. He publicly praised the radical students, calling their violent takeover a second revolution that was even greater and more important than the first one that removed the Shah. He used the hostage crisis to unite the divided country against a single common enemy, famously labeling the United States government as the Great Satan. For 444 long days, the American hostages were held captive in Tehran. This single event completely destroyed any chance of normal, peaceful relations between Washington and Tehran. It led to severe American economic sanctions, froze billions of dollars in Iranian assets, and deeply damaged Iran's international reputation for decades to come. The United States government, led by President Jimmy Carter, tried everything possible to free the hostages peacefully. When long diplomatic negotiations failed to produce any results, the American military attempted a highly secret rescue mission in April 1980. This mission, known as Operation Eagle Claw, was a complete disaster. American military helicopters crashed into each other in the remote Iranian desert during a sudden sandstorm, killing 8 American soldiers. Ayatollah Khomeini immediately declared that the deadly sandstorm was a direct miracle from God. He told the Iranian people that God had sent the sand to protect the Islamic Republic and to punish the arrogant Americans. This military failure humiliated the United States globally and made Khomeini look even more powerful and divinely protected in the eyes of his loyal followers. The hostages were finally released in January 1981, on the exact day that a new American president took office, but the diplomatic damage was entirely permanent. Khomeini's entire foreign policy was built on a very simple but highly radical slogan that was painted on walls across the country: neither East nor West, but the Islamic Republic. During the global Cold War, almost all countries aligned themselves with either the capitalist United States or the communist Soviet Union. Khomeini rejected both of these massive superpowers. He viewed the United States as an arrogant imperialist power that only wanted to steal Iran's natural resources and corrupt its traditional morals. At the same time, he completely hated the Soviet Union because of its state-sponsored atheism and its brutal military invasion of neighboring Muslim Afghanistan. This policy of total political independence was initially very popular among many Iranians who were deeply tired of foreign interference in their country. However, it left Iran with almost no friends on the global stage. When Iraq invaded Iran, almost the entire world, including Western powers, the Soviet bloc, and neighboring Arab nations, either supported Iraq or refused to help Iran. Khomeini's stubborn refusal to play by the normal rules of international diplomacy made Iran an incredibly lonely and isolated nation. While Khomeini aggressively challenged the world abroad, he ordered a massive and strict transformation of society at home. He firmly believed that political revolution was simply not enough. Iran needed a deep cultural and spiritual revolution to survive. In 1980, he launched what became known as the Cultural Revolution. The main goal of this movement was to remove all Western, secular, and non-Islamic influences from Iranian society, starting with the education system. Universities were seen by the religious clerics as dangerous centers of secular, liberal, and leftist thinking. By Khomeini's direct order, all universities and colleges across the entire country were completely shut down for 3 full years. During this long closure, the entire national education system was torn apart and rebuilt from the ground up. Textbooks for all ages were completely rewritten to reflect strict Islamic teachings and to heavily promote the political values of the revolution. Thousands of teachers, university professors, and students who were suspected of having liberal, secular, or communist beliefs were fired from their jobs, expelled from their schools, or arrested by state security forces. When the universities finally reopened to the public, they were tightly controlled by the religious government. Islamic loyalty and revolutionary purity became much more important than actual academic skill or scientific knowledge. This severe cultural cleansing ensured that the next generation of Iranians would be educated strictly within the narrow framework of Khomeini's personal ideology, but it also caused a massive brain drain. Thousands of highly educated professionals, doctors, scientists, and engineers fled the country in fear, taking their valuable skills with them to Europe and North America. The effort to spiritually purify Iranian society extended deep into every single corner of daily life. Under the rule of the Shah, Iran's major cities had active cinemas, bustling bars, and people wearing modern Western-style clothing. Khomeini's government quickly and forcefully shut down all nightclubs, completely banned the sale and consumption of alcohol, and outlawed Western music and movies. State-controlled television and radio stations were heavily purged. They were only allowed to broadcast religious programs, government news, and approved traditional music. Before the revolution, Iranian cinema was a thriving and popular industry. Under Khomeini's rule, many movie theaters were burned down because they were seen as places of sin and corruption. Once firmly in power, the government established incredibly strict censorship rules for any new movies or books. Men and women could not touch each other on screen. Musicians faced similar struggles. Pop music, rock music, and anything that sounded remotely Western was completely banned. Anyone caught selling or listening to cassette tapes of illegal music could be arrested and severely beaten. This strict control created a massive secret underground culture. Young people would secretly gather in their homes behind closed curtains to listen to forbidden music or watch smuggled videotapes of Western movies, constantly fearing a knock on the door. The most visible and highly controversial social change was the strict enforcement of the mandatory hijab, the Islamic head covering, for all women. Shortly after the revolution succeeded, Khomeini announced that women working in government offices should observe Islamic dress codes. This rule was gradually made stricter and wider until it became the absolute law of the land. Regardless of their personal beliefs, their political views, or their religion, all women in Iran were legally required to cover their hair completely and wear dark, loose-fitting clothing in public at all times. To enforce these new strict moral codes, the government created special units known as the morality police. These armed patrols roamed the streets of every city, constantly stopping people to check their clothing, makeup, and behavior. Women who were caught with a loose headscarf, showing too much hair, or wearing bright lipstick could be suddenly arrested, heavily fined, or publicly humiliated. Men were also forbidden from wearing shorts or short-sleeved shirts in certain public places. These aggressive policies completely erased the social freedoms that many middle-class Iranians had grown used to over the decades. While traditional and deeply religious families supported these strict changes, millions of others felt completely trapped in a society that closely watched and controlled their most private choices. The constant drive to maintain absolute political control led directly to one of the darkest, bloodiest, and most controversial events of Khomeini's entire rule. In the late summer of 1988, just as the devastating 8-year war with Iraq was finally ending, the religious regime felt highly insecure and deeply paranoid. An armed Iranian opposition group known as the Mujahedin Khalq, which had been based in Iraq and financially supported by Saddam Hussein, launched a failed military attack across the Iranian border. In direct response to this military attack, and deeply fearing that political prisoners already inside Iran might try to rebel or support the invaders, Ayatollah Khomeini issued a highly secret religious decree. He ordered the immediate establishment of death commissions across the country. These small, secret groups of religious judges and intelligence officers went to prisons across Iran and briefly interviewed thousands of political prisoners. Many of these young prisoners had already been tried years earlier and were simply serving their standard prison sentences for minor crimes like distributing political flyers, reading banned books, or attending peaceful protests. The religious judges asked them very simple, terrifying questions about their political loyalties and their religious beliefs. If the prisoners did not demonstrate absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the Islamic Republic and to Khomeini himself, they were immediately sentenced to death. Within just a few short months, thousands of political prisoners, including leftists, communists, students, and members of the Mujahedin Khalq, were secretly executed by hanging. Their bodies were loaded onto trucks at night and buried in unmarked mass graves in barren places like the Khomein cemetery near Tehran. The exact number of victims remains unknown because of extreme government secrecy, but human rights organizations estimate it was between 4,000 and 5,000 people. The families of the victims were treated with extreme cruelty by the government. For months, they were not told what had happened to their children, husbands, or wives. They were completely banned from visiting the prisons. When they finally demanded answers, government officials handed them small plastic bags containing the clothes, glasses, and watches of their loved ones, coldly telling them they had been executed. The grieving families were not allowed to hold public funerals. They were not allowed to mourn out loud or gather in groups. The state wanted to completely erase these young prisoners from history and memory. This brutal, secret purge eliminated the last remaining pieces of organized political opposition in the country, but it left a deep, unhealed, and bleeding wound in Iranian society that continues to cause pain decades later. Beyond domestic control, Khomeini's religious and political ambitions went far beyond the physical borders of Iran. He deeply believed that the Islamic Revolution was a perfect model that all other Muslim nations should copy and follow. He actively and loudly called for the overthrow of other governments in the Middle East, particularly conservative Arab monarchies like Saudi Arabia, which he viewed as deeply corrupt and far too close to the United States. This aggressive policy of exporting the revolution terrified Iran's Arab neighbors and caused massive regional instability. The most significant and lasting success of this foreign policy took place in the small nation of Lebanon. During the chaotic Lebanese civil war in the early 1980s, Khomeini sent units of the newly formed Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps to Lebanon to help organize, fund, and train local Shia Muslim militias. With Iranian money, weapons, and strict ideological guidance, these small groups merged together to form Hezbollah, which translates to the Party of God. Hezbollah quickly became a very powerful military and political force in the region, completely dedicated to Khomeini's religious teachings and actively fighting against Israel and Western influence. Through Hezbollah and similar smaller groups in other countries, Khomeini successfully created a regional network of proxy forces that extended Iran's power across the Middle East. While this gave the government in Tehran a powerful tool to project influence, it also resulted in increased regional conflict, international terrorism charges, and much deeper isolation from the global community. Khomeini's aggressive foreign policy also caused deep and violent problems with Saudi Arabia, the home of Islam's holiest sites. Khomeini strongly insisted that the annual Hajj pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca should not just be a quiet religious event, but a loud political one. He actively encouraged Iranian pilgrims to hold large, disruptive political protests in Mecca against the United States, against Israel, and against the Saudi royal family itself. The Saudi government, which was heavily allied with America, saw this as a direct and dangerous threat to their control of the holy city. In the summer of 1987, these growing tensions finally exploded into terrible violence. During a massive political protest by Iranian pilgrims in the streets of Mecca, violent clashes broke out with heavily armed Saudi security forces. In the massive chaos, panic, and shooting that followed, over 400 people were killed, and the majority of the dead were Iranian citizens. Khomeini responded to this tragedy with furious, blinding anger. He publicly declared that the Saudi royal family were absolute traitors to Islam and secret agents of American imperialism. Iran officially boycotted the holy Hajj pilgrimage for several years, and the deep hatred between Iran and Saudi Arabia became a permanent, toxic feature of Middle Eastern politics. Just when it seemed that the end of the devastating Iran-Iraq War in 1988 might finally lead to a quieter, more peaceful era of rebuilding, Ayatollah Khomeini sparked one of the biggest and most dangerous international controversies of the 20th century. In 1988, the famous British Indian author Salman Rushdie published a complex novel called The Satanic Verses. The fictional book contained dream sequences and magical realism that many conservative Muslims around the world found deeply insulting to the Prophet Muhammad and the Islamic faith. Angry protests erupted in several countries, and the book was quickly banned in many parts of the Muslim world. However, on February 14, 1989, Khomeini took this global outrage to a dramatic and shocking new level. He broadcast a special message on Iranian state radio issuing a strict religious fatwa, or decree, that officially declared Salman Rushdie's writing to be unforgivable blasphemy against Islam. The fatwa explicitly sentenced Rushdie to death, along with any editors, translators, or publishers who were aware of the book's contents. Khomeini called on all zealous Muslims around the world to find and execute them quickly. To encourage this violence, a wealthy Iranian religious foundation offered a massive cash reward of millions of dollars to anyone who successfully killed the author. The global reaction to this death sentence was immediate, explosive, and overwhelmingly negative in the West. Western governments were completely shocked and disgusted that a religious leader would issue a public death sentence against a private citizen of a foreign country over a work of fiction. The United Kingdom immediately broke off all diplomatic relations with Iran, and many other European nations quickly recalled their ambassadors in protest. Salman Rushdie was forced into deep hiding under heavy armed police protection for many years, constantly moving from house to house in fear for his life. Several innocent people associated with the book's translation and publication were brutally attacked, and a Japanese translator of the book was tragically stabbed to death. For Khomeini, issuing this shocking fatwa served a very specific and calculated political purpose. After the bitter disappointment of failing to win the Iran-Iraq war and being forced to accept a ceasefire, the fatwa allowed him to forcefully reclaim his position as the bold, fearless, and undisputed leader of the global Islamic community. It heavily reminded his most loyal followers that the Islamic Revolution was still alive, still radical, and still fighting fiercely against Western cultural domination. The fatwa clearly showed the world that Khomeini's authority and his absolute willingness to cause massive international outrage had not faded with old age. The 10 years of Ayatollah Khomeini's direct rule were entirely defined by a rigid, uncompromising vision of religious faith and political power. He was a unique leader who never apologized, never admitted a mistake, and rarely changed his mind. When faced with domestic opposition, his only response was total suppression and violence. When faced with international pressure, his only response was angry defiance. From the American hostage crisis that defined his very first year in power to the Salman Rushdie fatwa that defined his very last, Khomeini deliberately and constantly chose the difficult path of conflict over compromise. His strict cultural policies forced millions of Iranians to completely change how they dressed, what they studied, and how they lived their private daily lives. His rules created a highly controlled society where religious clerics held absolute, unquestioned authority over both the massive state machinery and the individual citizen. While these aggressive policies successfully secured the survival of the Islamic Republic and created a fiercely loyal base of followers, they also deeply alienated large segments of the Iranian population and isolated the country from the rest of the world. As the 1980s drew to a close, Khomeini had successfully built his pure Islamic state, but it was a state completely surrounded by enemies, deeply divided internally, and bearing the heavy, painful scars of war, secret purges, and endless controversy. His rapidly failing health meant that he would not live long enough to manage the long-term consequences of the turbulent and divided world he had created. As the final year of the 1980s arrived, the physical strength of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini began to fade rapidly. For a full decade, the aging leader had carried the crushing burden of reshaping Iran from top to bottom. He had survived a brutal 8-year war, massive international sanctions, and endless political turmoil through sheer force of will. But time and the relentless strains of leadership finally caught up with him. By the spring of 1989, his health had deteriorated to a critical point. His heart, which had endured the trials of revolution, exile, and war, was growing dangerously weak. The man who had commanded millions with a single word and struck fear into foreign superpowers was now confined to a hospital bed, fighting a quiet battle against mortal decline. Even as his body grew weaker, Khomeini's final months in power were marked by crucial political decisions that would shape the future of the Islamic Republic long after he was gone. One of his most important final tasks was settling the question of who would succeed him as supreme leader. Originally, Khomeini had chosen a prominent and high-ranking cleric named Ayatollah Khomeini Montazeri to be his designated successor. Montazeri had a long history of fighting against the Shah and was deeply respected within the religious establishment. However, as the 1980s progressed, Montazeri began to voice increasingly bold and uncomfortable criticisms of the government's harsh policies. He strongly condemned the secret mass executions of political prisoners that took place in 1988, arguing that such brutal actions violated Islamic morality and would permanently stain the reputation of the revolution. Ayatollah Khomeini had zero tolerance for internal dissent, even from his closest allies. When Montazeri openly challenged the moral authority of the regime, Khomeini acted swiftly and decisively. In early 1989, he officially stripped Montazeri of his status as the designated successor, cutting him off from the inner circle of power and placing him under strict house arrest. This sudden political fallout left the regime in a state of urgent crisis. With no clear successor remaining, Khomeini appointed a special council to revise the country's constitution and establish new guidelines for choosing a future supreme leader. Through these final constitutional adjustments, he ensured that the supreme authority of the country would remain firmly in the hands of committed, hardline religious clerics who would protect his uncompromising vision without hesitation. By late May 1989, it became painfully clear to his doctors and family that Khomeini's life was coming to an end. He was admitted to a specialized medical center in northern Tehran to undergo emergency surgery for internal bleeding. The news of his failing health quickly leaked to the public, sending shockwaves of deep anxiety and intense grief through his millions of loyal followers across the country. Iranian state television broadcast continuous footage of citizens gathering outside the hospital gates, weeping openly, praying fervently, and reciting verses from the Quran in the hope of a miraculous recovery. For a generation of Iranians who had grown up under his absolute rule, the thought of the Islamic Republic existing without Ayatollah Khomeini was simply unimaginable. Despite the desperate prayers of the nation and the best efforts of his medical team, Khomeini's failing heart finally gave out. On the night of June 3, 1989, at the age of 86, Ayatollah Khomeini passed away. The announcement of his death was broadcast across national radio early the next morning, plunging the entire country into an atmosphere of immense national mourning. Millions of grief-stricken Iranians flooded the streets of Tehran and other major cities, abandoning their daily routines to express their sorrow. Government offices, schools, and bazaars were immediately closed down for days of official national mourning. The dramatic scenes of public grief were staggering in scale, reflecting the deep, complex hold the aging leader had secured over the hearts and minds of his followers throughout the decade. Preparations for his funeral quickly became a massive logistical challenge for the new government. Millions of people from every corner of the country traveled to Tehran to catch a final glimpse of their leader and participate in the historic farewell. On June 5, the funeral procession began, drawing what international observers estimated to be several million mourners onto the highways and streets of the capital. The massive crowds surged forward with overwhelming emotional intensity, desperate to touch the wooden coffin carrying Khomeini's body. The sheer size of the crowd created a chaotic and dangerous situation. The emotional waves of mourners overwhelmed security forces, pushed past metal barriers, and briefly forced the wooden coffin to the ground as people tried to pull pieces of the shroud as sacred blessings. The military helicopter assigned to transport the body had to abort its landing because the crowds were simply too vast and uncontrollable. The chaotic funeral scene required the government to postpone the burial and bring the body back to a secure medical facility temporarily. Hours later, under the cover of a much tighter security operation, Khomeini's body was finally laid to rest in a massive mausoleum located along the highway leading to the holy city of Qom, where his political journey had begun decades earlier. The unfinished shrine quickly became a massive monument and a site of continuous pilgrimage for his loyal supporters. Even in death, Khomeini remained the undisputed focal point of Iranian political and religious identity, a towering figure whose monumental impact on the nation could not be easily measured or forgotten. The passing of Ayatollah Khomeini marked the definitive end of a tumultuous chapter in Iranian history. The man who had started his life as a quiet, scholarly teacher of Islamic mysticism in a small provincial town had transformed into a revolutionary titan who permanently altered the geopolitical landscape of the modern Middle East. He left behind a country drastically different from the one he had inherited under the Shah. A nation bound by strict religious laws, defined by fierce political defiance against the West, and bearing the heavy, enduring scars of war and internal division. As the tears of the millions at his funeral dried, the Islamic Republic was forced to step forward into an uncertain future, carrying the complex, heavy legacy of the man who had single-handedly remade Iran. As the sun rose over Tehran in the summer of 1989, the nation of Iran found itself standing at a profound crossroads in its modern history. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum and a country fundamentally transformed by a decade of revolution, war, and radical social restructuring. For 12 years, from his triumphant return from exile to his final days in a Tehran hospital, Khomeini had served as the absolute center of gravity for the Iranian state. He had taken an ancient monarchy firmly aligned with the Western powers and converted it into a revolutionary Islamic republic governed by the strict principles of Shia jurisprudence. Now, the heavy task of assessing his legacy fell not only to his successors in Tehran, but to historians, political scientists, and citizens across the globe who watched as the Islamic Republic sought to survive its founder. To understand the Iran of today, one must examine the sweeping scale of change that Khomeini engineered, looking closely at how his vision reshaped the political system, religion, society, and foreign policy of the nation. At the core of Khomeini's monumental project was a complete dismantling of the traditional political architecture of Iran. For centuries, the country had been ruled by monarchs who claimed absolute or constitutional authority, culminating in the Pahlavi dynasty under Mohammad Reza Shah. Khomeini completely rejected the legitimacy of hereditary monarchy, arguing instead that true sovereignty belonged only to God and should be administered by qualified Islamic jurists. Through the doctrine of the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, known as Velayat-e, he embedded religious authority directly into the machinery of the modern state. The supreme leader wielded ultimate control over the armed forces, the judiciary, the state media, and key regulatory bodies. This unique system created a complex and often contradictory structure of governance where elected bodies, such as the parliament and the presidency, operated underneath the overarching supervision of clerical authority. By fusing religious leadership with state power, Khomeini ensured that the clergy would remain the ultimate arbiters of political life in Iran, a structural reality that persisted long after his passing. Beyond politics, Khomeini fundamentally altered the religious and social fabric of Iranian daily life. Under the Shah, the government had aggressively promoted a program of rapid westernization and secularization, encouraging modern fashions, Western entertainment, and secular legal codes that often marginalized traditional Islamic practices. Khomeini reversed this cultural trajectory overnight. Under his guidance, the state instituted mandatory Islamic dress codes for women, replaced secular civil laws with interpretations of Islamic Sharia, and overhauled the educational curriculum to emphasize religious studies, revolutionary history, and Islamic values. For millions of devout, traditional Iranians, particularly those living in rural areas and working-class urban neighborhoods, these changes felt like a long-overdue restoration of their cultural dignity and religious identity. They saw Khomeini as a spiritual savior who rescued the nation from what he termed Westixification, the corrupting influence of Western consumerism and moral decay. However, for secular intellectuals, modern-day women, religious minorities, and middle-class urbanites who valued personal freedoms, these same policies represented a severe curtailment of their rights and a forced imposition of a rigid, monochromatic worldview. In the realm of foreign policy, Khomeini left a legacy defined by uncompromising defiance against foreign powers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union. His famous revolutionary slogan, "Neither East nor West, but the Islamic Republic," guided a foreign policy that sought to distance Iran from both Cold War superpowers and assert complete national independence. The seizure of the American embassy in Tehran in 1979 and the long-standing hostility with Washington established a framework of perpetual confrontation with the West. Khomeini viewed the United States as the Great Satan, an imperialist force bent on exploiting the natural resources and cultural integrity of Muslim nations. He also sought to export the message of the Islamic Revolution beyond Iran's borders, inspiring Islamist movements across the Middle East and positioning Tehran as the leader of the regional axis of resistance against Western and Israeli influence. This defiant stance won Iran fierce loyalty among various regional militant and political groups, but it also isolated the country diplomatically, triggering decades of economic sanctions, international suspicion, and severe geopolitical tension. Yet, the reality of Khomeini's Iran was deeply complex and could not be reduced to simple slogans of triumph or oppression. The 8-year war with Iraq, which consumed the majority of the 1980s, left deep physical, economic, and psychological scars across the country. Hundreds of thousands of young Iranians lost their lives on the battlefields, cities were heavily bombed, and the national economy was pushed to the brink of total collapse. Despite these immense hardships, Khomeini's charismatic authority and the powerful nationalistic fervor generated by the war helped keep the country unified through its darkest hours. Citizens banded together in communal sacrifice, believing they were defending a sacred revolution against foreign-backed aggression. The collective memory of the war became a foundational pillar of the Islamic Republic's official identity, commemorated through monuments, memorials, and public rituals that honored the immense sacrifices made by ordinary families. As the decades rolled forward following his death, the debates over Khomeini's legacy grew only more intense and polarized. To his dedicated followers and the governing establishment of the Islamic Republic, he remains an untouchable historical icon, a pious ascetic, a brilliant political strategist, and a divine instrument who restored Iran's independence and placed Islam back at the center of public life. Portraits of Khomeini continued to gaze down from government offices, university lecture halls, and roadside billboards across the country, serving as a constant reminder of the ideological boundaries of the state. Annual commemorations of his death drew massive crowds to his sprawling mausoleum, where loyalists reaffirmed their commitment to his uncompromising ideals and his vision of an unyielding Islamic state. Conversely, millions of other Iranians viewed his legacy through a lens of profound grief, frustration, and quiet resistance. For younger generations born long after the revolution, the rigid social controls, economic difficulties, international isolation, and restrictions on personal freedom became heavy burdens. Many silently or openly questioned the wisdom of a political system anchored entirely to the interpretations of aging clerics. Throughout the years, waves of protests erupted in major Iranian cities, driven by economic grievances, demands for greater political openness, and a desire to reclaim personal liberties that had been suppressed since 1979. These recurring social movements demonstrated that, while Khomeini had successfully reshaped the political structures of Iran, he had not erased the deep-seated desire of the Iranian people for freedom, prosperity, and a voice in their own destiny. Ultimately, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini stands as one of the most consequential and polarizing figures of the 20th century. He proved that a determined leader, armed with a powerful ideological vision and deep religious conviction, could mobilize millions of ordinary people to overthrow a heavily armed, Western-backed monarchy and completely alter the geopolitical map of the Middle East. Whether viewed as a visionary liberator who redeemed a nation, or as an authoritarian patriarch who plunged a rich cultural heritage into decades of isolation and conflict, his footprint on Iran remains indelible. The man who started his journey as a quiet scholar in Qom succeeded in remaking an entire nation, leaving behind a complex, contested legacy that continues to shape